On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, welcome to the final installment of Conserved Lands and Waters of the Lost Coast, a three-part virtual lecture series. My name is Justin Krellin, Administrative Coordinator with Friends of the Lost Coast, and tonight we will host Hawk Rosales, Indigenous Land and Ocean Defender and former Executive Director of InterTribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council, presenting tribal protected areas of the Lost Coast. Before we get started though, Friends of the Lost Coast acknowledge that the lands we gather on today are the traditional unceded territory of the Sinkyone and Mattole peoples, who have stewarded the land, water, plants, and animals from time immemorial with great respect for the interconnectedness of life and ecological knowledge that is foundational to the health and sustainability of the Lost Coast and its preservation for future generations. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. Participants, we ask that people remain muted with cameras off throughout the presentation until the Q&A. Please use the chat feature to seed Q&A questions or to share commentary with the group during the presentation. Now, without further ado, please welcome Hawk Rosales and his talk, Tribal Protected Areas of the Lost Coast. Thanks for joining us, Hawk, and please tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work, and the InterTribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council before you get started. Take it away.
Well, greetings, listeners, and thank you, Friends of the Lost Coast, for hosting this series and the presentation tonight about tribal protected lands. As Justin said, my name is Hawk Rosales. I am the former Executive Director of the InterTribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council. I worked for the council for 31 years. And then I retired in December of last year. However, I am still working with the council as a consultant to ensure that its work continues and that the legacy is ongoing. So the council is in a transition phase at this point until a new director comes on. Priscilla Hunter, as Justin also mentioned, is unable to join the meeting tonight. Something came up for her, but the Chairwoman Hunter requested that I make the presentation on behalf of the Sinkyone Council, which I am very honored to do today. It's a real honor to be part of this effort still. And so without further ado, we will go into the council slideshow. Next slide. The Sinkyone Council was formed by local tribes to protect Sinkyone from further industrial logging and to help revitalize and heal the land and the tribal communities of this region. These tribes all retain important, there are members within all of these tribes, individuals and families, that all trace their lineage directly to the Sinkyone lands and waters, and who have a variety of other long-standing cultural relationships in these places. Next slide. This is a map that unfortunately is an older map, but it's so it's kind of fuzzy, but it depicts the Sinkyone traditional territory. And along the coast, this goes from a point that is just north of Rockport to an area just south of the mouth of the Mattole River. And from there inland to the divide between the main stem and the South Fork Eel River. Though at the very far north of the territory, there is an area that includes several miles of the main stem eel. Next slide. Indigenous Sinkyone people's relationship with these lands and waters go back to the beginning of time. They are intergenerational and they are preeminent. These are also unceded lands and waters. And what does that mean? Because you hear that term now more than before, and sometimes people are puzzled by it. It means simply that the original peoples of this region and elsewhere, Indigenous people, did not relinquish their inherent rights or their inherent responsibilities to care for these places, to have deep relationships with them. Even though many things have happened that have harmed our communities and the natural world of which Indigenous people are the guardians, those rights and responsibilities have never been ceded. They have never been relinquished. They have been denied, and they continue to be denied in many ways. But it is important for people to understand that those rights and responsibilities still stand today. Next slide. It is important also for people to understand that the Sinkyone and the other tribes of this region and elsewhere took diligent care of these ecosystems through every aspect of their lives, because they followed the laws of nature. Next. And the laws of nature and Indigenous law are in harmony with each other. I'll explain that a little bit further in, but those laws, which have been in place for millennia, resulted in this great diversity of life, which the next slide. Many species of birds and sea mammals, next slide, and other forms of marine life, next slide, as well as elk and many other mammals. And this particular group of elk might also be called a marine species because they are enjoying the ocean and they swim out about half a mile or more every year, or most years. And this has been witnessed. Some of you may have witnessed that. Next slide. So I want to explain a little bit further about what I meant by Indigenous law, the laws of nature. Indigenous land laws have existed for many, many thousands of years. They instruct how humans are meant to behave with responsibility and respect toward all other forms of life, which in fact possess inherent rights that must be upheld. Indigenous land laws are based upon the laws of nature. That is, the movements and behaviors of the sun, the earth, and other planets, stars, the seasons, winds, rains, tides, plant and animal communities. Also inherent to natural law are metaphysical, spiritual forces, of which humans know only a little. These laws of nature are encoded into the laws of Indigenous societies since the beginning of time. Tribal nations retain preeminent responsibilities and rights, as I noted earlier, and those are rooted in Indigenous and natural systems of law and governance that predate all subsequent laws and governance systems that have been imposed since the arrival of the first non-Indigenous peoples. Next slide. Tribal nations have inhabited, loved, and cared for their lands and waters since the very beginning of time. This photograph of an ancient redwood tree, which in the Sinkyone language is kasjo, is illustrative of that idea of the very beginning of time, because these trees, some of them that still remain, are over 3,000 years old. And these traditional territories cover vast inland and coastal areas. With the Sinkyone, this is true for the Sinkyone as well as many other neighboring coastal peoples, and the ocean waters. So keep in mind that the tribal territories do not end at the shoreline. They go out many miles, and in some cases indefinitely. The tribe's inherent rights and responsibilities to these places are, as I said before, but cannot be overemphasized, pre-existing and preeminent, and have never been relinquished. Those rights and responsibilities are determined neither by persons nor by institutions, but by the laws of nature and the tribe's long-standing relationships with nature. So, Indigenous land laws are diverse bodies of society-specific, place-based codes and protocols, which are dictated by and therefore in alignment with natural law. Indigenous land laws are expressed in an endless variety of forms and venues and informed by spiritual beliefs, instructions, and understandings. When natural law and Indigenous land laws are adhered to, there is abundance and balance. When they are not, there is chaos and suffering. Next slide. This is an aerial, I guess a satellite image of the Sinkyone coastal lands before the logging, industrial heavy logging began in the 1960s. So I believe this is from the early 60s, this image, I'm not certain, but sometime in the 60s. And next slide. So a lot of the heavy logging at Sinkyone began in the late 60s, early 70s. And this is what it looked like. Next slide. This is that same location with a satellite photograph showing the extent of that destruction from what the previous photo, two slides back, showed, which was a almost entirely intact forest at that time. I just also want to take this opportunity to point out that for countless generations, tribal nations have stewarded terrestrial and marine environments. And they did this in a way in which there was, the basis of that was this respect, this very respectful and diligently maintained relationship. It's all about relationship. And that was done in order to nurture these ecosystems, the balance of them, and the well-being of all these different species, which are interdependent upon each other. And so for Indigenous people, our intergenerational reverence and care of nature has helped ensure a legacy of biological diversity and abundance that has benefited everyone on this planet. And yet now more than ever, this legacy is imperiled. Today we stand at a tipping point. And that tipping point, we've been there for a while, but it's getting worse. So we've almost tipped over it, I would say. And it is a direct consequence of society's disrespect for nature and greed, including this insatiable appetite to endlessly extract what people refer to as resources. We believe that a myth has pervaded here for over 200 years, that humans have a right to take from nature with little or no limitations. Next slide. These are photographs of some of the people who survived the era of Holocaust, which was occurring at the same time that the era of ecocide began in the destruction of the ancient redwood forest. This is Sally Bell and her husband Tom Bell And as many of you may know, Sally Bell survived a massacre of her people in the 1860s, which occurred around Needle Rock. She was a little girl at that time, but she witnessed her entire community being killed. And she and a few other children survived. And then they fled into the forest where they lived. And, you know, they struggled to survive for about a year or so until some white settlers, they encountered them and they took them into their home. So this is part of the legacy of the so-called Lost Coast, is this terrible harm that was done to the original peoples. Literally thousands of Sinkyone and other neighboring tribal peoples within a period of about 15 years were killed, or, you know, they died as direct consequence of the invasions into their homeland, the theft of land, the forced removals, the foreign diseases, rape, you know, just on and on, endless, you know, atrocities. And so next slide, here are some more survivors, some family members. And, you know, a lot of these families lived in and around the Lost Coast after the massacres occurred. Many of them also eventually joined neighboring tribes and became members. The Sinkyone, as well as many other tribes in the region, tribal peoples, did not ever receive federal recognition, but descendants of those original peoples are within the membership of all of the Sinkyone Council's member tribes and many other tribes in the region that have Sinkyone descendants, including the Bear River Band of Ronerville Rancheria. A lot of Sinkyone people there. It is hard to, you know, talk about these histories, but it's important that we do take the time to express the facts about them. And as a Native person, I also, you know, feel that it's very important to talk about how we feel and how this has affected us intergenerationally, and it still, you know, affects us now. We are in a process of healing. We are seeking healing, and we are welcoming healing into our lives personally and into our community's lives. And the Sinkyone Council has been a catalyst for that. Sinkyone Council was formed for that purpose. Next. Next slide. Yeah, this is a slide with Sinkyone Council. Okay, so this is a summary of, you know, a brief summary of the Sinkyone Council's purpose and, you know, why it was formed. And also just one other remark about this era of destruction is that, you know, the connection of the land and the people, and the fact that there is this great love between the Sinkyone people and their lands and waters is really what enabled the people to survive and to begin this healing process, which has been long and, as I said, ongoing. But it's all based upon that identity that the Sinkyone and other Indigenous peoples have, which is this long-standing relationship with their places of origin. And so it is the land where these answers for the healing are. And I think that it is also important to accord respect and to thank and to recognize the Sinkyone people and the ancestors for the fact that they did survive, they did fight for their lives, and they are with us still today and always will be. Next slide. These are the 10-member tribes of the Sinkyone Council. 7 of them originally formed the organization, and then in subsequent years, 3 additional tribes joined. So these are all 10 of them. Each of these tribes has its own, land base. They're much smaller land bases than originally they were, and there are many ethnicities of different tribal peoples within each one of these tribes. And so, there are people that trace their lineage to not only Sinkyone, but to a broad range of different tribal peoples in this area beyond. Next slide. And so this has been the work of the Sinkyone Council, is to, reclaim their role for the tribes on these coastal lands that have been referred to as the Lost Coast, although sometimes tribal people are kind of puzzled as to why, people call it the Lost Coast. I mean, they know why it's referred to that with that term, and yet, for them, they have never felt lost there. But I guess it's appropriate in the sense that those lands were taken, by force from the original peoples. And so they were lost to them for a time. But beginning in 1997, the Sinkyone Council, next slide, began a process of the return of this land to the council on behalf of its member tribes for a process of long-term stewardship and healing. And so in 1997, the first area of land was acquired and protected, and that is 3,844 acres, and that was acquired from the Trust for Public Land. And this was at the tail end of a process that had been going on for a number of years, in which a lot of local activists back to the land people, non-Indigenous people living in and around the southern Humboldt, northern Mendocino County area had organized and had said, enough of this logging. We want to, protect this area for the remaining old growth that still is here. So they began to organize and taking legal action and civil disobedience. And they reached out to the tribes at that early time and began conversations with them. And there was a lot of meetings and a lot of discussions and, people getting together and just, thinking about what could be done and working on the possibilities. And from that emerged the Sinkyone Council with the purpose, the very clear purpose to have these lands returned and to participate in revitalizing them, to help lead that process. And over the last 35 years, the council has emerged as an international leader among Indigenous peoples and among the so-called conservation communities to illustrate how this can and should be done in a very collaborative manner. It hasn't been easy, and some of our work has been controversial, but the council has always persevered and continued to do the work that it set out to do, and will continue to do that work. Next slide. So a lot of the work that the Sinkyone Council did after and even before acquiring the first 3,844 acres was restoration work in the streams. And some of that work had been done by other people earlier, and it continued. And some of that work still needs to be done. And so the council will be, engaging in that in future years with more tribal members and others. Next slide. Crowfoot, salmon, is considered, very sacred being. Again, a being that has rights and has its own culture, has its own behaviors, and has this ancient lineage and place in the world. And so, it isn't a resource in the sense that this is someone to be harvested and, eaten, although that certainly is important. But that's not all that this animal represents. It represents balance and abundance, and it is a key and critical part of a healthy ecosystem. And so for that and many other reasons, salmon and all the other animals and plants are regarded as relatives, not just figuratively, but literally as relatives. Next. This photograph shows restoration, in-stream restoration that the Sinkyone Council designed and implemented back in the mid-90s and early 2000s. And this is that stream corridor after that restoration and some of the installation of some of these habitat logs. Next. The council also engaged in a multi-year watershed rehabilitation in which about 50 miles of old unraveling logging roads in the Sinkyone State Park were removed. And the council played a key role in that and had tribal heavy equipment operators there and cultural monitors. And it was a really good project that had a great success. Those slopes have been stabilized and they are now, continuing the process of recovery. Next, this is some of the heavy equipment that was necessary for that work. Next. And this is what it looks like after. Next. This is looking south from Needle Rock. Many of you are familiar with that view. Next. This was a young tribal dancer at one of the cultural gatherings that the council for many years has held, but has not held them since the pandemic, but hopefully will do so again in the near future. Next. And this is how to reach the council. We encourage you to visit the council's website. And I also want to follow up from this slideshow by saying that in 2012, the Sinkyone Council was received a gift of or donation of some land from Save the Redwoods League. It was 164 acres of land that is called Four Corners. And that is a very important place for the Sinkyone Council and its member tribes. And that land is protected, as is the larger earlier property that was acquired in '97, protected with a conservation easement. But most importantly, is protected by tribal tenure. So tribal tenure in this case is legal ownership, and the council's commitment to making sure that no development or subdivision or industrial uses or activities are allowed on in these places. They are, places to be memorialized in the sense of the relationship that they represent for Indigenous people. And as I said earlier, that is an intergenerational ongoing continuum of relationship. It isn't something that is relegated to the past. It isn't something that's going to just be revitalized in the future. It is an ongoing continuum because the ancestors are with us still, and the future generations are at this time being dreamed of and contemplated and planned for. At the end of last year, the Sinkyone Council also received the donation of 523 acres of additional land from Save the Redwoods League. And this land is located about midway between the Four Corners property and the council's larger InterTribal wilderness land. And this latest land contains about 200 acres of old growth redwood. And this was a 2-year process of collaboration between the Save the Redwoods League and the Sinkyone Council to structure a transaction and a conservation easement and accompanying instruments to ensure the protection and stewardship of this land in perpetuity. So the council is very excited about, the continued efforts of land return. A lot of people are talking about the return of, returning to the land, or the return of land. And this is all interrelated. These efforts have to be led by Indigenous peoples. And so myself and many other tribal leaders across the US and this hemisphere are now working together with a number of partners to plan and to implement the return of various traditional lands. And Sinkyone is an incredible, inspiring example, maybe one of the earliest examples of how so many tribes came together to collaborate to make that happen in a very positive and spiritually oriented way. And that work will continue. So many of the things that the Sinkyone Council has accomplished with regard to policy and the precedents for reestablishment, and recognition of tribal rights and responsibilities in marine areas, with the marine protected areas. There's just so much that is very unique and that has not been done anywhere, but where tribal peoples in other regions are looking to this example to model their efforts similarly. In July of this year, the Sinkyone Council was featured in the National Geographic. There was an issue devoted to Indigenous peoples and their return of their lands. And in the editor's letter of that edition, there were remarks about the Sinkyone Council and its work. And there was a photograph of the council's council members. And National Geographic approached the Sinkyone Council quite late in its, I think it was a 2-year effort to put this story together. And so the council, it was too late to include the council in the actual story because it was about ready to be published. But they were just completely, blown away by the council's work. And so they said, we must include you in this. And so the council's board members, I think it was 7 of them, are pictured in that July issue. And if you go to the council's website, you can find the link to that. If you go to the news page there, and it's www.sinkyone.org. We urge you to, visit that site. The last remark I want to make is it's very important that we honor Indigenous women and Indigenous men, but especially Indigenous women, in the sense that this council is comprised of 9 Indigenous women who have been leading their communities in this effort. And Sinkyone Council has been mostly throughout its 35-year history, almost 36 years now, has been led by women, predominantly by women. So we're very grateful for that, all of us. And the work that they do and that the Sinkyone Council does, it's for all life on this planet and for the sake of the future generations of not just all people, but all life forms, because people are important, but so are all the other species. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I think Justin may now want to move into another segment of this program.
Great, thank you, Hawk. That was awesome, and thanks for everybody for joining us. We're going to be moving into the Q&A portion of the lecture. So if folks have questions, we invite you to either put them in the chat or to turn on your cameras or unmute yourselves and ask questions. I guess before we get started, Hawk, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about tribal protected areas. Obviously, the work you all have done has kind of been a model for the larger tribal protected area movement. And I wondered if you could speak a little about tribal protected areas in other locations, in other regions.
Certainly. The concept of tribal protected areas has been around for a while, and it's really a very, for each area, it's going to be unique and different based upon tribal views of the universe and cultural ways. But essentially it means that the decision making and the governance of those lands is by the tribal entities from that place. And there are a wide variety of different structures and instruments, legal and policy, ways of memorializing and implementing a tribal protected area. And so there are a number of them. I think one of the older ones that was established in the early 70s, perhaps mid 70s, but maybe early 70s, is a place in Montana. And it is called the, in English, the Mission Mountain Wilderness. It is within the reservation boundaries of the so-called Flathead Reservation, which is the Confederated Salish, Kootenai, and Kootenai tribes of Montana. And I have visited there and been their guest. And it's a 92,000 acre tribal wilderness that adjoins the Bob Marshall Wilderness. There is also the Blue Lake precious tribal lands, which are held by the Taos Pueblo. That was established even earlier by a presidential decree in the 1960s. And I believe it's more than 40,000 acres, maybe about 45,000 acres perhaps. And it's at a place called Blue Lake. And this is a tribal protected area that is not accessible to anyone except for members of the Taos Pueblo tribe. The Sinkyone lands are also not open to the public. However, for the Sinkyone Council's larger property, the 3,844 acre that was established in 1997, that is there will be 2 public access trails open soon, we hope. The trails are completed, but they're not yet open to the public. And so that the public access through that land will be limited to those 2 trails. And of course, if there are existing roads that are public roads or access trails to the state park, like the Wheeler Road, that's open to the public too, but not the other parts of those properties. There are a number of other places here in California and elsewhere where tribes have either established or they're in the process of establishing tribal protected areas. That work is really picked up since the so-called 30 by 30 effort to protect nature was initiated about a year and a half ago or so. So many tribes are now partnering with state or federal agencies and conservation organizations to plan for the return of lands and the restoration and stewardship of those lands. That's happening in California and elsewhere. So myself and others are in discussion about that, and we are really excited about what the future holds for tribal communities here and elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Looks like we got a question in the chat. It is the Navy still testing sonar or other weapons that harm marine life on the Sinkyone coast?
The Navy's training and testing program is continued or is continuing in the region that goes from essentially the Humboldt-Mendocino County line north all the way to Puget Sound and the Canada border. That program has not, and it probably will not in the near future at least, be dismantled or discontinued. However, if you go to the Sinkyone Council's website, the news section explains the work that the council engaged in over the last 8 years or so, I think it was, to significantly reduce impacts to marine mammals and other forms of marine life within that training and testing range complex. And last year, the NOAA and NIMS agreed to a number of mitigations that the council had been advocating for and insisting upon. And so all of those mitigations, you can read about those, but although the training and testing does continue in that region, it has been significantly modified to accommodate those demands of the Sinkyone Council and its member tribes, that different kinds of or more limited types of training and testing activities take place. And it was a long, hard fight, but finally there was agreement to that. But I will also say that it has a ways to go, and the council and others still feel that more work is needed there.
Great, thank you for that question. So I did allow folks to turn on their cameras, and yeah, great. Looks like we got a question here.
Hi, I have a question. Hi, Hawk. It's Jen with Humboldt Baykeeper. It's great to hear this whole history, and especially in light of all the land return movement that's happening all over the state now. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what sorts of things might need to be done in that area to adapt to or address sea level rise or other climate change concerns that were not really, at the forefront when the lands were first protected. Just if there's anything going on in that regard. Thanks.
Yes, that's an important topic. And I think a lot of what we anticipate could be some of the changes due to climate and related phenomena are beyond what, we just don't know to what degree these things are going to, we can guess. There are people modeling these things and, assuming that such and such is going to happen, but we really don't know. And really along the Sinkyone coast, there isn't a whole lot of development like infrastructure and things like that. But I do know that California State Parks, Save the Redwoods League, and some other parties, BLM probably as well, are engaged in, examining what may need to be done, modifications, adaptations with regard to certain human related, activities and infrastructures or, things like that. So that's good. But I think that, nature has clearly showed and will continue to show us more and more that that they are the true sovereign. Nature is the power that cannot be controverted by anyone, really. And so all this climate change, of course, is a consequence of people not behaving correctly, not abiding by protocols and laws that are intended to maintain balance in the universe. But I know that the Sinkyone Council is concerned about these issues as well, but we also have to, I think, realize that we cannot combat climate change. So we shouldn't be trying to fight it, but, because we should do things to stop it from being worse. There's a whole lot of things we can all do to reduce the contributions that we have as humans to the terrible thing that's going on. But But really, we all need to realize that nature is going to take its own course here. And we need to find better ways of relating to nature, to respecting and working with nature. And I also really like this concept of obtaining the consent of nature. People, I don't think, are aware of that, but it's necessary. It certainly is necessary within Indigenous cultures to obtain the consent of nature. Nature is a living being. And if we find ways of communicating and truly communing with nature in the ways that we are supposed to, then many of the problems we now face can be addressed in very positive ways and hopefully reduced.
Thank you. Looks like Stephen, you have your video on. Do you have a question for the group? Or?
No, no, I don't.
Okay, saw your
But
camera on, so yeah.
Well, I
welcome.
just,
Go
why
ahead.
not,
Okay, yeah, so if other folks have questions, we'd encourage you to turn on your cameras or unmute yourself. I think everybody should have the ability to do that. Otherwise, you can put your question in the chat. And I guess in the meantime, I was wondering, Hawk, if you could talk a little bit more about the land back movement, and for folks locally who are living in traditional Sinkyone territory and are thinking about what they might do with their properties in the long run. Is there any advice you have for folks who might be considering, donating their land to the InterTribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council?
We have been contacted by certain people over the last couple of years or so. Seems like more people are interested in talking about that. But it's also important for people to understand that this idea of land back is not a simple idea. For some people, I guess it is, but it really is not. It's quite complex, and there's a lot of parts that a lot of things that have to be considered and undertaken to make it happen in the right ways. Like if a tribe just gets back a bunch of land, but they don't have the infrastructure, the capacity, or the resources to take care of that place, and that can be a problem. And sure, a tribe would welcome that in many ways, but I think what people fail to recognize still is that, but they're beginning to, is that there is a lot of responsibility that goes with that, and that there has to be support for tribes to do this land back effort or efforts successfully. And so that is what I have been, as well as others have been, urging partners and governments to do, is to make sure that part of this planning process and implementation includes sufficient resources, financial and otherwise, for tribes to take on these efforts so that they can successfully care for these places in the long term. Many tribes have, high levels of poverty, and they don't have the resources just sitting around to manage these lands and to restore them and to monitor them and to steward them and all of that. So it's essential that land back is a holistic approach that includes planning and capacity and implementation. Capacity and administration, and all the resources necessary to do this in the right ways. And so I really want to urge people to understand and think about that more, beyond just the return of land.
Great. So any other questions out there? We're getting towards the end of the hour here, and would love to give one last opportunity for folks to ask any questions if they're still out there. Seeing none, I think we would like to thank everybody for coming out tonight on behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and King Range National Conservation Area. Many thanks to Hawk Rosales and the InterTribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council for this lecture. We hope you found it educational and inspiring. Visit lostcoast.org or our YouTube channel for a recording of the lecture, which will be posted in the coming days. Thanks again for tuning in tonight, and to learn more about Friends of the Lost Coast or to make a donation to support our work, including programs like this lecture series, please visit our website at lostcoast.org. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and now TikTok. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and all the best from Friends of the Lost Coast. Thanks again, Hawk, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.